Hello everyone, welcome to week 2 of EDST 536, Foundations of Canadian Higher Education. Today we will be talking about the question of why histories and foundations of higher education matter in the first place. Why is this a topic that we include in this course? Brief discussion of Canadian higher education history, then the question of counter-histories of Canadian higher education, and then looking at UBC as a case study from which to look at the foundations and history of Canadian higher education. So the first question is, why do histories and foundations of higher education matter? And we have two people offering their thoughts on this. The first comes from Rosalind Hampton, who's a professor of Black Education Studies at the University of Toronto. And she writes that understanding the conditions under which universities were founded in Canada reveals their intended roles in society and provides a baseline for understanding how they have and have not changed and are not changing now. So she wrote that in the context of her dissertation about McGill University and the history of its founder, McGill, and his entanglements with colonialism and slavery. And then she looked at how this affects the experiences of Black students and academics in the contemporary moment. Then we have a quote from UBC President Santa Ono, and this comes from his apology for UBC's complicity in the Indian residential school system. And he says that failing to confront a heinous history, even if it is one that we did not cause, is to become complicit in its perpetuation. This is not a result that we, as a university, can accept. So, for me, when I think about the importance of foundations in higher education and history, it has to do with the way that we understand where we're coming from, where we currently are, and where we're going. And in particular, the way we understand the past shapes the sense that we make of the present, how we arrived here, whether we feel like the present is a continuation or a deviation from the past, and also what we imagine as both desirable and possible for the future. So it's my sort of contention that if we look differently at the foundations of higher education, we can pluralize and open up possibilities for the way we imagine higher education in the future. So, guiding questions for this week and the topic, which you can think alongside in relation to this lecture, alongside your readings for the week, as well as your discussions and your first mini paper. So, which and whose histories of higher education tend to be emphasized? Which and whose tend to be dismissed or minimized? How are different histories and foundations of higher education mobilized? In what ways, in whose name, and to what ends? In other words, what do people do with these histories and foundations to make them come alive and to impact the present and the future? What are the dynamics when new dimensions are introduced to an organizational history or foundation? So, in other words, what happens when we have one idea of what an institutional history of higher education looks like and someone brings in a new dimension that we hadn't paid attention to before? And finally, how does our framing of a higher education system or institution's foundations shape our understanding of the present and our notion of what is desirable and possible for the future? So in the Jones reading for this week, you got a nice brief summary of the history of Canadian higher education. And I'm not going to rehash that because I think he does a really nice job, but I did want to make a bit of an observation about Canadian higher education history in terms of scholarship. In 1985, Nancy Sheehan sort of bemoaned the fact that Canadian historians hadn't paid that much attention to the history of Canadian universities. And in 2008, Alcorn, who was writing a dissertation about the University of Saskatchewan, said that really not much had actually changed since 1985. We still don't have a ton of history of Canadian higher education. We have several institutional histories that focus on the history of one institution or histories of one specific era. There are more and more of those. But in terms of especially an overarching view of the history of Canadian higher education, there's not much. That summary from Jones is actually one of the more accessible and updated ones. There's also this book from 1976, which I have the image of here, which is by Robin Harris. It's an enormous book, so it sort of surveys the entire history of Canadian higher education from the 17th century to the 20th century, the mid-60s. And there's a ton of information there, but it's in many ways it's sort of a list form. It goes through each era and provides details about that. It doesn't have much of a narrative or much analysis about how higher education in Canada really developed. So if this is a topic you're interested in, then there's a lot of work to be done, and I encourage you to pursue it. But as far as I understand it, not that much has changed. We still don't have, unlike, for instance, in the US, where there are several different overarching textbooks of Canadian higher education, there's not much here. Now, in addition to this sort of mainstream history that you got from the Jones article for this week, there are counter-histories. So, of course, we have the counter-history that Stanley offers, which is also a reading for this week, and he's writing specifically about UBC. But we also have others. So one comes from Blair Stonechild, who wrote this book, The New Buffalo, that's an optional reading for the week during indigenization and decolonization. But what I thought was really significant for this week was her statement that Indigenous peoples have always had and continue to have their own forms of higher education. Before colonization, they undertook lifelong pursuit of specialized knowledges in order to become hunters, warriors, political leaders, or herbalists. So in other words, this statement, this observation really challenges us to rethink when we put the starting point of higher education on this continent and the lands that are currently known as Canada. So in other words, actually well before European colonists arrived, Indigenous peoples had their own forms of higher education that were in many cases repressed by the colonizing power, but had have been retained by Indigenous people over time. And then we have this other article from Peace. If you're interested, I put the link there since it's not in the recommended reading list. But he actually tries to go back and attend to the ways that Indigenous people were present in early higher education in Canada, even when they were absent. So they were an absent presence. Even though they weren't generally enrolled in the institutions, their presence and the role of colonization was extremely present. And he sort of prompts us to think about how we connect Indigenous peoples to broader processes of colonialism in higher education and rethinking the past and the history of our institutions. So we already have these prompts to go beyond the mainstream narrative of Canadian higher education. And as we have moved into more of indigenization of higher education in Canada, this is becoming more and more relevant. But I do notice that in many cases, we are more focused on the present, and the past seems quite distant, and we're not always making the connections between the past and present, and again, how it shapes the future. So that's sort of the focus of the lecture for this week. So I think the best way to get at this dynamic is to actually think about a specific example of UBC, because it's one that we're generally familiar with. And then I think we can sort of extrapolate out from UBC to other institutions in Canada as well. So one way of entering into this conversation, especially on an institutional level, is to talk about organizational sagas. And this is a concept that comes from Burton Clark. It's sort of a foundational concept for higher education studies. And he writes that an organizational saga is a collective understanding of unique accomplishment in a formally established group. The group's definition of the accomplishment, intrinsically historical, but embellished through retelling and rewriting, links stages of organizational development. It includes affect that turns a formal place into a beloved institution to which participants may be passionately devoted. So an organizational saga is really a kind of institutional mythology, and it includes some actual events that happened, of course, but it also includes exaggeration, an emphasis on tradition, and in many cases it has a kind of challenge narrative that was overcome by the institution. So there's some kind of struggle in the institutional history that is surpassed, and then the institution can be proud of its existence, and this kind of invites a lot of investment from members of the university community. They can feel proud of their institution, they can feel invested in it. It's something that is cultivated also as a means to get student buy-in and alumni buy-in, alumni donations. So whether they call it this or not, most universities have a kind of organizational saga that seeps into the institution. And the task for the rest of this lecture is to think about what is the organizational saga of UBC, how is the mainstream version of it generally portrayed, what are the challenges to that, and how much is it being rethought at the moment. So we can ask, what are some key dimensions of UBC's organizational saga? Who is generally emphasized within it? Who is generally left out? And what is generally left out? Why are these things left out? And what purpose does the saga serve for the institution and its goals today? So one place to start is thinking about the historical narratives that we have of UBC and its history. And there are, for instance, these timelines on the university website. There are several different timelines, actually. There's one on the library website, which is called A Brief History of UBC. And we see that there is some reference to what was here in what is currently the UBC campus prior to the UBC campus being here. So some acknowledgement that Musqueam was inhabiting these lands for thousands of years before UBC arrived. But there's not really an account of how the process of colonialism took place and UBC's role in that. And we also have this other timeline that was created for the UBC centennial a few years ago. And it actually starts in 1908, so there's no acknowledgement of what happened prior to that, and there's very little acknowledgement throughout of Musqueam's historical and ongoing presence in this place. We also have the Great Trek. So I would say that if we're looking for where in the UBC organizational saga is the narrative of struggle and overcoming, this is it. So I don't know if you've heard of the Great Trek, but it is infamous in institutional lore. This is a story, this image is from a story in 2015 in the Alumni magazine that's actually called Trek, after the Great Trek, so you can see its influence. And the history briefly here is that when UBC first opened in 1915, it was actually located in what is now the site of the Vancouver General Hospital downtown. So Point Grey had been selected as the site of the university, but because of World War I, there was a halt in construction, and by the 1920s, UBC students were frustrated with their temporary digs and built a campaign called Build the University, and got over 50,000 signatures, and ultimately decided to lead this walk, this great trek from downtown to Point Grey to essentially stake their claim to the land and demand that the university be built there. And generally this is brought up as a moment of pride in UBC's history because the students were so excited about the institution that they wanted to make it happen, and we celebrate their initiative, their enthusiasm, and is generally seen as sort of this pivotal moment in the institutional history. So what might be the counter-narrative to this mainstream organizational saga of UBC? We have, of course, the Stanley article, who raises this question of how did this European cultural institution come to be located on the west coast of what is today Canada? And he says that this is very much a matter of the history of colonization by people of European and principally British origins. So in other words, how did it come to be that in this place, this indigenous land, where there had been indigenous forms of higher education for thousands of years, how did that come to be replaced by Western thought and Western educational traditions? And he says, in a word, colonialism. And of course, you also have Musqueam elder Larry Grant, who some of you may know. who wrote that this was sort of rhetorical question. You know who the biggest benefactor of UBC is? It's not Kerner, it's not Barber, it's not Allard, it's Musqueam. And of course, Kerner, Barber, and Allard are these big donors to the university who have buildings and even whole schools named after them. And he says, yeah, we celebrate these guys, we put their names on everything, but you know who gave the most to UBC for its existence? It's actually Musqueam. And unlike those big donors, Musqueam didn't do it willingly. So this is quite a different history than the one that's generally offered by the university. And I think if we go back to the Great Trek, it causes us to rethink the framing a bit. So if generally speaking, we think of this exciting moment of students coming to this place and claiming it as their own, when we think about the fact that they were claiming Indigenous lands that was claimed through colonialism, we have quite a different sheen on the story. And while likely the students weren't thinking of that at the time, because colonialism was the norm, as it still is now, how might we rethink or reframe this proud saga of the Great Trek with this critical history of colonialism in mind? So we do have, actually, increasingly the institution taking up some dimensions of this counter-narrative of history. So there was a UBC Aboriginal Centennial page, which was sort of parallel to the sort of mainstream UBC Centennial pages. And they had, for instance, a hidden history, which offered an alternative timeline of UBC and really emphasized the role of Indigenous dispossession, for instance, in enabling UBC to inhabit these lands. We also have the fact that UBC in 2012 acknowledged and apologized to Japanese Canadian students who had been enrolled at UBC in the 1940s during World War II. And UBC was actually complicit in their removal and their internment in the Japanese internment camps during this time. So UBC issued an apology and gave honorary degrees, thanks largely to the advocacy of these students, not because it did it on its own accord, but it did become now part of the organizational saga. Not one that's put at the front, but one that is there if you look hard enough on the institutional website. We also have this initiative from First Nations and Indigenous Studies at UBC, where they have created this digital mapping tour in collaboration with Musqueam to encourage people to rethink their presence on these lands and what that means. It's still in progress as far as I know, so I check back there every so often just to see, but I think it's going to be a great resource once it's completed. We also have now these Musqueam street signs at UBC. So in addition to the English names of places, we also have Musqueam names produced again in collaboration with Musqueam. So we see more and more that these other histories of UBC, especially histories that are not so shiny and celebratory, are becoming part of the institution's organizational saga. But the question is, how are these histories incorporated? Are they actually incorporated in a way that really shifts the mainstream narrative, or is it more of an add-on? Yes, we were amazing. We had the Great Trek, we had these proud histories, and there was also some bad things too. Or does it actually cause us to rethink the celebratory narratives full stop in a way that would tell quite a different story about the entanglement of the university with these colonial relations? So, in other words, is it conditional inclusion of the stories or substantive shifts? And this quote comes from Rauna Kuakanen, who's a Sami scholar who did her PhD at UBC in 2004. And she wrote at the time, "The Musqueam are recognized when it's convenient for the university, but ignored, neglected, and pushed aside on other occasions, particularly when the university wants to represent itself, walk on the spotlights, as if the sovereign master to the outside world." So in other words, when it's convenient to have the Musqueam there, UBC does it. When it's not, they're somehow conspicuously absent. Now this was over 15 years ago, And we might say that certain things have changed, especially with Truth and Reconciliation Commission and related shifts in the institution. But we can also ask how much has really changed. And I actually invite you to reflect on that question. And not just ask how much have changed, but how has it changed? How are these different counter narratives or counter histories included in the UBC organizational saga now? And how much and in what ways are they there, but not necessarily highlighted? So you have to really be looking for them, for instance, if you are interested, rather than them being front and center. So I'll close with a recent article from the Vancouver Sun. So this is not written by UBC, but UBC administrators were interviewed for it. And it's actually an article about Westbrook Village and really celebrating UBC's innovation, essentially, for turning their campus lands, which another way is framing that is turning their expropriated Indigenous lands into this source of profit by building housing and other developments on this land. So the story tells how this alumni and business person, Robert H. Lee, proposed to use these lands to build housing and create a new endowment fund for the university that have now, at this point, or at least actually last year, raised $1.6 billion in profits. So we have, for instance, Santa Ono being interviewed for the article and celebrates this vision as creating a stable, autonomous, unprecedented source of funding, and really emphasizing that future generations will benefit from the, he says, the opportunity to control and resell the land, to continue to benefit research, teaching, and learning at UBC. And then we also have the Associate VP of Campus and Community Planning, emphasizing that universities plan for 1,000 years, they don't plan for 50. So here we see this celebration of the way that UBC has actually taken this land that it claims as its own and monetized it even further. And we see in this article no mention of Musqueam, what they think of this, how they feel about their land being used in this way. And although we have in other places, for instance, the apology I mentioned earlier from Santa Ono, an assurance about his commitment to working with Musqueam in a respectful way, here they suddenly disappear. So there may be some continuities with Kuakanan's observation that the Musqueam are included when it's convenient and excluded when it's not. So I will leave you with this as something to chew on. And it's a topic that, this topic of higher education foundations and colonialism is something we can revisit in the week on indigenization and decolonization. But more broadly, I invite you to think about, again, how are we narrating the foundations and histories of our institutions? And how does this affect how we view them today, how we understand current challenges, and how we're envisioning this future? Is it we're planning for 1,000 years to be here unproblematically, or is it we are working toward a different kind of relationship with the Indigenous custodians of this place? So I will leave you with that. Thank you so much. I look forward to our conversations in the online discussion.